Hi, so today we're going to be talking about assessments and specifically assessments with coaching and coaching clients. So assessments are there to understand the person that you're coaching, the world they live in, and also have them understand themselves. So they have multiple uh, objectives. And there are a few different kinds of assessments. Most of them do one of three things. They open up a door for the person you're coaching to understand themselves better and leads to higher self-awareness around their style or their personality or their behavior. Also, it can open the door towards understanding how other people view those people, and this can help them take some actions towards goals and changes they want to make. The For the coach, I always find it useful, not only for the client, but for me to understand the world they live in. Sometimes it's just understanding their behavior because I don't get a chance to, I only see them with me. I don't always see them with other people. Sometimes I do, but often I don't. And it gives me an insight into them, then gives me a language, depending on what assessment or what kind of work I'm doing with them. It can give me a language to talk to them and kind of organize things because people don't really remember lots of things. If you try to talk to them about all the things they need to do, it sometimes gets a little bit too much for them. So assessments kind of filter things down into one model or one theory or one process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. So the first thing I want to talk about is the kinds of assessments. There are two kinds. One is with numbers, so quantitative. So that's called quantitative. So think about it. It's quantifiable. We use numbers. And then there's qualitative, where you have stories. You have narrative stories. You're using words. So those are two different kinds of assessments, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what they are and how to use each of them. So a little bit about each of them. So quantitative surveys are instruments with numbers like Likert scales, and we'll show you that in a minute. Their focus is on measurement of variables. So usually there's some kind of model like emotional intelligence, so that's behaviors. Preferences would be something like the Myers-Briggs. Do you prefer to be an introvert or an extrovert? Do you prefer to be are you more preferring thinking versus belief and feeling? So those are different, those kind of instruments, you can call them quantitative. They're based often on theories that are built on qualitative data, but we've kind of put numbers to them and we're able to measure where a person fits. To analyze it, we use statistical data, and we want the information to be valid and reliable. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but one of the restraints of quantitative is it fits people into a box or framework. So for example, if we're going to give somebody an assessment looking at their emotional intelligence, we're only looking at it through those four quadrants of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. We may be missing something or some depth or some details around, for example, decision making, or we might be missing something around creativity, right? So we could miss something using quantitative data. When we use qualitative, the method we use is interviews for coaching. Sometimes when you're doing a group work with qualitative, you could use a focus group. Generally, you've got open-ended questions. The focus is on what people say and feel. So when we interview for qualitative, we're often interviewing first of all, we talk to the person we're coaching and we get data from them, right? So we're always getting data from the person we're coaching, but we could also interview people around that person and find out how they see that person. So we get a view of their reputation. The focus for qualitative is what people say and feel about that person, and that includes the person themselves. So it's their stories. The analysis is it takes longer to analyze this. You can't just put it through a computer screen. You need to look for patterns and themes. It can capture more elusive, subtle information. So sometimes so when you get quantitative data, I might find out that somebody's an introvert by doing the Myers-Briggs, right? And they agree, yes, I'm an introvert. But then if I do qualitative in data, I might find out, well, this person never talks in a group. So now I'm finding out like the behavior that happens. Not everyone that's an introvert doesn't talk in a group, but this person who's an introvert doesn't talk in a group. And so I get kind of the why behind the what as well. It's like, well, why is this a problem? Is it a problem? And I could find out a little bit about it. And then the restraint for qualitative data is you're actually collecting the data and you're analyzing the data. So it's prone to researcher bias or subject bias. So you're biased. Often I find myself when I'm doing interviews for somebody, I'm on their side. So when somebody's saying a bunch of negative things about a person, sometimes it's hard for me to take it in because I'm like, well, they're not that bad. I don't see that in them. So I could kind of soft shoe it a little bit more than it really is, even though I'm talking to somebody who might be having real problems with it. A little joke over here. I always like a little comedy here. It talks about quantitative method with giving out free ice cream. So when you're doing a quantitative method, maybe we are offering free ice cream and we could say 1 in 30 take free ice cream. That's interesting. So now we know 1 in 30 take it. When we have a qualitative method, we could find out why only 1 in 30 are taking it. What did you feel when you saw the free ice cream? And the person says, well, I was excited, but I was a little scared. Okay. And why is that? So you get a chance to really figure out what's going on with a person. So qualitative takes more time, is more in depth, and is prone to bias. Quantitative takes less time, is more structured around a theory or a concept or a model, and it does not take a lot of time. But you do get some good information in both ways. So it's important to I use both. I sometimes use one or the other with clients, but I often use both. A little bit of an example here, types of assessments. Usually with quantitative, we're usually using a Likert scale. This is an example of a Likert scale here. So it's like terrible, bad, regular, good, very good, excellent. And you could see 5-point scales, 7-point scales, 10-point scales. I would say if you ever wanted to, you could Google Likert scales. And there are different ones. You could measure satisfaction, likelihood, level of concern, awareness, frequency, agreement, formality, quality, and importance. So there's different ways of using it. So you could say things are very poor, poor, acceptable, good, or very good. That would be quality. Or I often use likelihood, very likely, likely, not really likely, unlikely, very unlikely. So and frequency is another one I use very often. Always, often, sometimes, rarely, never. So does this person, so the person that I believe that's the way the 360 for the emotional intelligence survey is set up. And then with qualitative, you're telling stories, and they're maybe usually answering questions like the person should do more of, what should the person do less of, what should they keep doing. So it gives you more of a story. You could say, well, what are some examples of that? So you could get some stories about the person. Again, here's a little example of qualitative versus quantitative. This one was done by somebody in our coaching group who did some interviews. We had a bunch of people at the beginning doing some interviews of people in our first coaching leader program, and this is what came out. This is the data they gave us at the end of those interviews, that there were all of these different positives, and if you look at the different words, and they did it in a heart because that was what they experienced. And this is more of a quantitative when we asked a bunch of questions. Am I confident in my coaching skills? So, about 70% agreed with that. And then we had a whole bunch of people that agree and a bunch of people that nobody disagreed or was undecided or strongly disagreed. So we felt that that was a pretty good rate at the time. So that's qualitative and quantitative. If we want to look at more about qualitative for coaching, you would usually use a qualitative 360, and we'll talk about that next time. And also then assessments and instruments. So we'll talk about that as we go along in this process.